go ahead and say welcome everybody and thank you for joining us today. We're going to talk to you today a little bit about these processes and kind of how we interact as a nonprofit in order to preserve some of the important resources in our area. So again, thank you for joining, and hopefully by the end of the conversation, we'll have a round of questions and try to make sure that we leave some time to address any outstanding concerns. Obviously, some of these subjects are fairly complex, but based on what I've seen as far as attendees to this conference, I think many of you have some familiarity with these processes. So we're going to do our best to provide general overview. Please try not to yawn too much during that. At the same time, understand that we're just trying to make sure everybody has a general level or common understanding of the processes and how they work before we get into any examples. Next slide.
There we go.
So here's my ugly mug once again. Dan Holmes, Director of State Policy for the Piedmont Environmental Council. I'd like to introduce my colleague, Adam. Adam.
Hi, good to be with you all today and work on policy issues, state level policy issues for PEC, as well as some local land use issues in a couple of the counties in our 9-county region. So glad to be with you.
Okay, thanks. Next slide, Adam. So really quickly, I'm just going to post the outline up here. I had no need for me to read every little aspect of this, but I'll just tell you a little bit about what we're going to be talking about today. One, just to provide a little bit more familiarity with Piedmont Environmental Council, kind of the work we do, and using that as kind of the basis for why we get involved in these processes and why we utilize these tools to advance some of the natural resource and historic and other objectives we have in our region. We'll go through briefly kind of what these different processes are, how they interact, and then we'll hopefully, again, go through an example of a more recent project that we've worked on to kind of highlight how the view shed and views are taken into account when trying to address either avoidance or mitigation of some of the important resources that we're trying to protect. Next slide, Adam. So PEC has been around for about 50 years now. As you can see with this kind of abbreviated version of our mission statement, this pretty much means that we try to protect everything in our region. So again, but also recognizing what it is that makes our region special and ensuring that the public has the ability to engage in decisions that are important to their quality of life and that have a major impact on that region. Next slide, Adam. So our region, just to give you a quick idea of where we're located, again, Loudoun County up to the north and all the way down to Albemarle County in the south. Kind of Route 29, for those of you who are familiar with transportation resources in the region, kind of forms the backbone of our region. But to the western edge is the Shenandoah National Park, and again, a lot of the conservation efforts that we work on are water related, or again, trying to build off of some of those existing public resources that we have. Next slide, Adam. So I told you a little bit about kind of how we look at protection of our region, but ultimately, and I'm going to use these words in reverse, it's our job to empower the citizenry to get involved in these important decisions, to provide them with information that they can use to educate them on, providing them information they can use to weigh in intelligently on those land use matters that directly affect them, and as well making them aware of those opportunities for public engagement. So is there a local board of supervisors hearing? Is there a 106 process that they may want to get involved in? Is there a state public hearing on an important matter that they would want to weigh in on? Next slide up. Real quickly, just kind of telling you since the inception of PEC back in 1972, we always saw the need for protection of 1 million acres in our region. It's kind of looking at that, sustaining 50% of the natural ecosystems in our region, providing the natural environmental quality that we would need to sustain ourselves in the long haul, as well providing that agricultural and forestal reserve that supports the economy that allows for our region to remain largely intact. So obviously we have not reached that goal yet, but I will say we're well on our way. And noting that our goal is consistent with other goals as well, both Commonwealth and at the federal level. Most of you are familiar with the 30-30 goal that's recently come out. And again, that's 30% of the land and waters by 2030, with a larger goal of 50% by 2050. And again, just highlighting the fact that this is a shared vision of many conservation partners. Okay, Adam? How far are we towards meeting that goal? Again, with the public lands, and that includes federal, state, and local public lands, about 125,000 acres in our region. Additional 427,000 acres have been protected through private conservation easements, for a total of 552,000 acres. So while it is a steep climb to gain another 448,000 acres over the next 30 years, that is something we're committed to as an organization, and glad to see resources coming to the table in the future that potentially will help us achieve that goal on a more rapid pace. Okay, Adam. Why do we do what we do? Well, one of the main reasons that we work on these issues is, again, protecting the water we drink and in which we recreate. Again, recognizing that direct link to water quality as it relates to the land uses that surround those water bodies. Next slide. And lastly, again, just putting our region into a larger context. Again, while we focus a lot on local water quality initiatives, recognizing that we're a part of a larger system, and that water quality improvements that happen in our region are helping with our objectives with regard to the Chesapeake Bay and other larger regional concerns. Next slide. And lastly, just kind of telling you a few of the things that we're doing in our region is, again, working to reduce impervious surfaces through direct land conservation initiatives, but also weighing in on significant land use matters that impact water quality. Again, better land management. This is through education of landowners in our region, but also, trying to get some of those best practices on the ground. Recognizing the value of streams and rivers through scenic river designations, and again, language within comprehensive plans, supporting the preservation of those water resources. And lastly, direct action on pursuing improvements to stream stabilization and stream restoration, including the removal of culverts which block fish, but also raise additional concerns with regard to the resiliency of some of our systems. So with that, I believe I'm turning it back over to Adam to start to talk about what we're here today for, which is 106, National Environmental Policy Act, and visual resources management. Adam?
Thanks. Yeah, thanks, Dan. And I'm going to go off video here for a minute to make sure you all can continue to hear me. Had a little bit of a shaky internet connection today. So I know most of the folks who are on this call right now probably have experience with either a Section 106 review or a NEPA review or otherwise. So we'll try to run somewhat quickly through just background on what these reviews are, how they take into account visual impacts and those processes before launching back into a sort of specific example discussion that the PEC has worked on relatively recently. So in regards of Section 106, what does it mean when someone says Section 106? And it refers to a specific section of the National Historic Preservation Act, which was signed into law 55 years ago in the mid-1960s. And what this section does and why it's been so important for historic preservation over the past 50 plus years is that it directs federal agencies to take into account the effects on historic resources of projects that they carry out or assist or fund or permit or license or approve throughout the country. So if there is a project that has a federal nexus with the potential to affect historic properties, that's how the Section 106 review process comes into play. It's important to note that Section 106 reviews apply whether or not a project is actually taking place on federally controlled property that way. And generally for the purposes of Section 106, historic properties mean any prehistoric or historic districts, sites, buildings, or structures that are either eligible for or already listed on the National Register. But if a historic property is not listed in or has not previously been deemed eligible for the National Register, then as part of the Section 106 process, it should be evaluated by the federal agency in consultation with consulting parties and the SHPO. So let's see if this works. So how does the Section 106 process sort of really play out? How does the process itself work? The first step in initiating the process is to establish whether whether an undertaking is subject to Section 106 review. Does the project have the potential to impact historic properties? And part of that process is to identify and to contact potential consulting parties, your SHPOs, TIPOs, local governments, local historical societies, and to plan for public involvement. And once it's been determined that a action is subject to a Section 106 review, that's when the meat of the process really begins, which is identifying and evaluating and determining those effects in consultation with consulting parties. First, there's consultation to establish the scope of the review, so that the areas of potential effect are determined, and within that area, the potential for historic properties and historic resources are identified. Once the historic properties, with the potential to be affected are identified, the next step is to, is for the effects of those properties from the undertaking to be assessed. And that's done through consultation with the public and with consulting parties. And through this evaluation and consulting process, any adverse effects to the historic properties have to be considered, and effort has to be made to develop and consider alternatives or project modifications to avoid, minimize, or mitigate those adverse effects. Often the final step in the process before our project proceeds is the formalization of a memorandum of agreement, which would stipulate the measures that will be taken to ameliorate any adverse impacts that way. And if an agreement can't be reached, then the matter will head to the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation. There are a number of sort of off-ramps in this process, so to speak. If the undertaking is not subject to review, if during the identification stage it's determined that no historic properties are affected, or if during the evaluation of adverse effects it's determined that no historic properties are adversely affected. So there are a couple sort of exit ramps that way. Would also note that it's really important for consulting parties and the public to not only be encouraged to participate, that's sort of incumbent on the agencies and their consultants, but it's also very important for the public and consulting parties to actively engage in these processes. They bring expertise and knowledge to the table that the agencies might not otherwise be aware of or have on their own. So that's Section 106. By contrast, the National Environmental Policy Act has its own review process. NEPA, which was signed into law a little bit later in January 1970. And what this act does is it requires federal agencies to assess the environmental effects of their proposed actions prior to making decisions. For actions that will significantly impact the environment, agencies are required to prepare detailed statements assessing those impacts and to identify alternatives to those proposed actions. So the range of actions covered by NEPA is pretty broad, and it includes everything from making decisions on permit applications to adopting federal land management actions to constructing highways and other publicly owned facilities. As with Section 106, agencies are required to provide meaningful opportunities for public participation during a NEPA review process. As for the process itself, like you can see up in the flow chart on the screen here, a federal action can be categorically excluded from a detailed environmental analysis when the action won't have a significant effect on the environment. But an agency can also determine that a categorical exclusion does not apply, and then the agency may then prepare an environmental assessment, and the EA determines whether or not a federal action has the potential to cause significant environmental effects. And generally, that EA would include a brief discussion of the purpose and need of the proposed action, any alternatives, the environmental impacts of the proposed action and the alternatives, and a sort of enumeration of the agencies and persons that were consulted on it. And then based on an environmental assessment, the agency can either determine that the action will have no significant environmental impacts and will issue a FONSI, or a finding of no significant impact, which presents the reasoning for why the agency has concluded that there are no significant environmental impacts to occur based on the action. And if the environmental assessment determines that the environmental impacts of a proposed federal action will be significant, then they proceed to develop an environmental impact statement. And the regulatory requirements for an EIS are more detailed and rigorous than those for an NEA. In terms of comparing sort of the two processes together, there's a number of ways that Section 106 and NEPA overlap and interact. NEPA does encompass considerations to impacts of a wider range of resources than does Section 106. Obviously, Section 106 is focused more so on effects to historic properties, whereas NEPA's evaluation of environmental impacts is much more encompassing. But both these processes do require opportunities for public review, participation, and comment, and that's a very important part of both of these processes. Obviously, the final product of these reviews is different, with Section 106 also often resulting in a memorandum of agreement, and NEPA review often leading to environmental assessment or an environmental impact statement. I would say it's important to note that wherever possible, the timing of these reviews should be coordinated by the agency or their consultant that's pursuing the undertaking. So just briefly talking too about the way these two processes treat visual impact analysis. Under Section 106, the National Historic Preservation Act does not specify a specific methodology for conducting visual impact assessments under 106. SHPOs may establish requirements for conducting a visual impact analysis under 106, or federal agencies, may work with SHPOs to establish programmatic agreements on the conduct of visual impact analyses. But generally, visual impact analyses conducted under 106 assess a proposed project or action's effect on the integrity of the historic property. And in the case of visual impacts, the integrity of setting, feeling, or association is normally the concern. Section 106 review may use a sort of a key observation points style of visual impact analysis. And Section 106 reviews, often use viewshed analysis and may use visual simulations, such as the balloon test you see on the screen there. In a Section 106 visual impact analysis, impacts are classified only as adverse or not adverse effects without using a graduated scale of magnitude, which is a little bit different than the NEPA review process. And also, unlike NEPA, Section 106 does clearly specify what would constitute an adverse effect that way. And under NEPA, by contrast, with regard to visual impact analysis, neither the Act itself, neither the National Environmental Policy Act itself, or the Council on Environmental Quality, which oversees NEPA, they don't have any guidance to define what visual impacts actually are necessarily. Federal agencies generally determine for themselves what constitutes visual resources and impacts, and therefore agencies have pretty considerable leeway in terms of how they conduct assessments of visual impacts, including how they would analyze specific resource impacts. Some federal agencies, have issued their own guidance for developing environmental impact statements that include fairly specific instructions for visual impact analysis, and we'll talk about that actually on the next slide with an example from the Bureau of Land Management. But contractors who are involved in a NEPA review on behalf of or in support of an agency may choose a methodology established by a federal agency, such as BLM or otherwise, as a sort of default visual impact analysis approach, even when the proposed project doesn't necessarily affect lands administered by that agency. And with NEPA, in contrast to Section 106, visual impacts are usually classified by importance along a graduated scale that way. So VRM, and talking about a little bit about the Bureau of Land Management's approach to assessment of visual impacts. The visual resource management is BLM's system for inventorying scenic values and establishing management objectives for those values through the resource management planning process. Included within the visual resource management system are mechanisms for identifying visual resource values on BLM lands, minimizing the impacts of surface disturbing activities on visual resources, as well as maintaining the scenic values of these tracts of land for the future. The visual resource inventory process that's part of this VRM system, serves as the principal consideration when making VRM decisions that may protect or affect the landscape character and its scenic integrity during land use planning. And then visual impact mitigation measures are measures taken to avoid, reduce, or offset those adverse visual impacts resulting from development or land management activities. So how do these processes relate to your work, to our work, if you're in state or local government? Obviously, the Section 106 and NEPA processes offer an opportunity to influence the outcomes of undertakings with a federal nexus within your jurisdiction, and to ensure that the important historic, cultural, and scenic and environmental resources that contribute to tourism or the local economy are protected and taken into account with these federal undertakings. For those of you that represent conservation or preservation organizations, the NEPA and Section 106 processes are an opportunity to help ensure that the resources that you or your organization cares about are protected, or at the very least that the impacts to them are identified and evaluated and addressed before a project moves forward. And similarly for property owners, it represents a chance to protect your property and property values and your interest that way as well. So to tee up Dan's discussion of a specific example in Prince William County, how does PC in general engage with the Section 106 and NEPA processes? We will request consulting party status for projects with a federal nexus that are likely to have a meaningful impact on resources within our service area, within our 9-county service area. Actually, the example we're giving is just outside of it, but we get involved there nonetheless. We work with local organizations and local governments and the citizens and residents of our 9-county region to alert them to projects within these jurisdictions and area of interest, and to encourage their involvement and to make them aware that these processes are going on. We will actively participate in consulting party meetings or provide written or oral comments on our view on the impacts of these resources. Dan will show this in just a minute, but we'll utilize our GIS mapping capabilities and viewshed information and materials to help inform discussion of the impacts of those resources. And we actively participate in the process and work with the other consulting parties and agencies in an active and good faith attempt to come to agreement on avoidance or resolution of these adverse effects, so that these can be addressed and that the projects where necessary can go forward. And that's it for me.
Okay, so coming back down to kind of the on the ground level and how we engage in these processes as an organization. Oftentimes we're dealing with larger resources that are, in the case that I'm going to share with you, it involves a National Park Service unit related to Manassas Battlefield. And so oftentimes we're asking ourselves, what impact would this project have on the community or the visitor experience at those locations? And that raises kind of the what makes a place question. the resource versus the surrounding environment, and how much that resource relies on that surrounding environment for interpretation or for its protection. These impacts go beyond visual. Most of the things we're going to be talking today about in this example are visual. However, a lot of these conversations also involve, in the specific example that we're sharing with you, it's a transportation project. So auditory impacts were also a part of that conversation. And in this case, we're going to be dealing with some elevated ramps. So, ultimately, it's not just the visual, it's the broader impact of the area or the context of the area. How do we anticipate or model those impacts? We'll go into a little bit about that, what we bring to the table walking into these conversations, as well as what we kind of request from the agencies that are considering the action, as well, kind of walking through, are there other alternatives? If there aren't alternatives or not an ability to avoid the impact, what level of mitigation should occur in order to minimize to the greatest extent possible any impact to the resource in question. So that's just kind of the broad overview of what we're looking at here. Adam, next slide. So just to provide an example of this, oftentimes in this specific case, it was a cell tower that we were looking at and trying to determine what the visual impact would be. We have the ability through our GIS system to go ahead and conduct that kind of preliminary assessment of where this in this case, the cell tower would be, what lands would it be visible from? And, I'm not going to go into the complexities of our mapping system, but basically you're entering everything. You're looking at existing tree canopy, you're estimating range of size for that tree canopy and factoring that into the equation when you're trying to determine. And then the argument becomes how far away is far enough away for it not to have an impact, at least specifically with regard to some of these larger proposals like a cell tower. Moving on, again, the example that we're talking about here today are two flyovers that were proposed as a part of the solution for I-66 moving forward. These were proposed as elevated ramps. And as you can see in the top kind of right-hand corner of this graphic, that land is owned by the National Park Service. I don't believe the congressional boundary for the park is shown on this, but I do believe that in certain areas it expands beyond what the Park Service currently owns. And by congressional boundary, I'm just referring to the land that's been authorized by Congress if the park unit was ever to be increased, the park in question, again, being Manassas in this case. So once these ramps were proposed, ultimately it was clear that there was going to be an impact on the battlefield. And so therefore, a 106 was pursued. And we, as a consulting party, along with many allies in the conservation community, weighed in with Virginia Department of Transportation, as well as FAMPO, the consultants or the engineering company that won the bidding contract for this actual improvement. All right, go ahead, Adam, next one. So in this case, again, we were dealing with a couple of alternatives. Both seeking to locate two elevated ramps within the view shed of the park system. And neither as they were proposed were acceptable to either the Park Service or, for that matter, the consulting parties that were involved. Adam, next slide. So one of the first things in trying to address what the impact was going to be on the park was to look at the significant park resources that were within the boundary that would be impacted. And one of those that's kind of highlighted there in the light blue, I believe that's where the Portici House is. And I'm not going to get into the history of the Manassas battlefield, but a significant resource, the southern boundary of the battlefield. And the Portici House, again, was one of those areas where there is opportunity for significant visitor interaction. So understanding what that would do to the visitor experience at that specific location was fairly important. And again, there was another resource located to the north as well that we were looking at. Adam, next slide. And what this graphic is here to do is to show something incredibly complex to make a very simple point. When modeled, the elevated ramps were demonstrating that truck traffic specifically, because you're looking at, in this case, what is the highest point of visual impact as it relates to the proposed action. And in this case, again, we were talking about the large trucks that would be accessing these ramps, and both from, again, as I mentioned earlier, what that means from a visual impact, but also from an auditory standpoint or impact. Obviously, large diesel engines climbing ramps can create a lot of noise. So the steeper the ramp, the higher the elevation, the more impact it was going to have on the resource. But what this is trying to indicate that as you reached a certain point on the ramp, the elevation of the traffic on that ramp or anything that was on that ramp, say lighting, signage, or the like, was going to get into the view shed or bump into the view shed of these important resources from those locations that we discussed earlier. Adam, next slide. So what happened? Ultimately, once we were able to demonstrate the level of impact, we were able to talk to VDOT and their construction firm that was pursuing the project about ways to lower the ramps or reduce the visual impact. And ultimately, while this wasn't, I view this as a fairly large success. We knew that the VDOT was very interested in pursuing this transportation improvement. But again, by being able to demonstrate from those specific sites the visual impact, we were able to get them to agree to eliminate one of the ramps entirely out of the view shed and actually move that further east along I-66, away from the National Park Service lands. The second ramp, which was on the westbound side of I-66, was actually re-engineered and lowered to drop it below the existing tree line that's present on the Park Service property and just outside of it. Agreements as well in areas where vegetation was scarce to increase the vegetation in that area to provide further coverage and protection of the view shed from those sites. Adam, next slide. So as Adam indicated, all of this agreement after the redesign and multiple meetings with consulting parties discussing all the various options for mitigating this impact, those agreements or those provisions were contained within the memorandum of agreement. And I would like to go just a little bit further into to go beyond what just the elevation of the ramp and the relocation of the ramp. It went into great detail, including things related to the surface treatments of the ramps themselves, again, acknowledging the fact that they were in a fairly significant area as far as history was concerned, and trying to utilize both design as well as color schemes that were more acceptable to the Park Service. It included provisions that would keep the lighting, any elevated lighting off of the ramp, signage off of the ramp. The lighting was to be hidden within the parapet walls of the actual ramp. Signage was being done at ground level coming up to the ramp. So again, getting these agreements set within, or getting these provisions set within the agreement was essential to ensure that the mitigation that was discussed will be provided for. And lastly, as well, it included the language with regard to money to provide for additional mitigation to the Park Service. And one thing that was very important to the Park Service in this example was doing the cultural landscape report for that area. And there was some additional money, I believe, for some preservation of a specific parcel. I want to say somewhere roughly around $150,000. So while not a substantial amount of money, it did provide some additional resources to the Park Service to conduct or continue on with some of the preservation efforts in the area. And I'm seeing a question just came in. Does Conserve Virginia data come into play for these types of projects? That's a good question, Lynn. Ultimately, it does, in the sense that other agencies are there talking about what resources are important to them, and now whether or not that reaches that level Conserve Virginia data layer. I would have to go back in and look for any specific projects, but I haven't seen the 106 process yet that where Conserve Virginia model was specifically mentioned. However, again, many of the resources that you would expect to show up in the Conserve Virginia data layers are the very ones that we're talking about in these cases. That may gain more traction as DCR continues to pursue that model. But for right now, I think it's more just the fact that if something's eligible on the register, DHR has already got that in mind, and so that's obviously on the table. So yes, I think there's overlap there, but I haven't heard specifically Conserve Virginia data mentioned. Adam, next slide. And just kind of wrap it up again, talking about some of those visual treatments. Right now, as we're speaking, there is a little a board up that shows these different treatments right along 66, so people can drive by and kind of take a look at it and get a feel for what they prefer. This is the Park Service just kind of testing out what their preferred color scheme and design or pattern would be for any kind of concrete ramp that was built in the future. Adam, next slide. And again, lastly, just showing you the detail. And this became actually the subject of an entire meeting in the 106 is, again, the placement of specific trees and the species that would be selected to provide the best screen as it relates to some of these projects. So again, just to indicate the level of detail that you sometimes wind up getting into in these conversations is fairly high. Next slide. I think that ends our presentation. So with that, ready to open it up for questions. Thank you. I'm seeing another question come in from Len. Do you think the work you did on Manassas MPS could have been as successful if PC was not involved? I don't want to hang it all on PEC. There was a broad group of organizations that were involved, but I can absolutely say no. Without the involvement of those organizations, speaking up specifically for the resources, without the support we were able to provide entities like the National Park Service and fighting for their needs and preserving these resources, I absolutely don't think that I can't think of a 106 process that doesn't benefit from having greater public involvement, and specifically those from those entities that have knowledge about the resources impacted, or for that matter, potential mitigation solutions or alternatives to the project as currently proposed. I'm not seeing any other questions in the chat, but more than happy to entertain any.
Yeah, so I have another one.
Yeah.
Since no one else is asking. I mean, one of the things I've always been impressed with PEC is the amount of technical skills that you all have gotten on your staff and with your people to be able to help communities with these particular things. And so what I'm wondering about, like, what kind of recommendations can you give to others about how to use or garner or capture that kind of technical skill, where they might go to get it, how they might be able to apply it? Because you all are a very unique entity. You have a reasonably good size, so you have some diversity in your staff as well. So anyway, that's just... Well,
I'll just say, Len, I'll speak from personal experience, and then if Adam has anything to add, then by all means he should jump in. But most of us, when we come to work for a nonprofit, didn't come from necessarily the field in which we end up kind of working. My background's landscape architecture. So while that did provide me a good amount of information with regard to general planning and zoning conversations, as well as some of the, prepare me a little bit to have conversations about visual impacts and the context of the landscape. Most of the skills and most of the information and knowledge that I've gained throughout my career at PEC is just being exposed to a bunch of different things and ultimately trying to, provide the best service that we can to our members. it's active, ongoing education of your staff, and not being afraid to be involved in these processes. Yes, they're clunky. Yes, they're government processes trying to solve extremely difficult problems. But ultimately, I'd say staff retention is always one of those big things, because as these expertise are developed, you don't want to lose them. So ensuring that multiple members of your staff are exposed to these types of processes and understand how they work allows for better engagement in future years. So I would just add that second part. But no, I don't think most of us did not come to this, come to the table with a historic preservation background per se, an air quality background per se, but we developed these expertise over the years that we served the organization that we work for.
And I would just echo, I would echo everything Dan says, but also just speak to the importance of, even for folks who just don't have that technical background or expertise, or are members of the public, that their involvement and engagement in these processes is no less important that way. I think certainly for communities, underserved or underrepresented communities, often the folks who live there are more aware of resources that might be present in those communities, historic or otherwise, than an agency or somebody who covers a much wider region might be aware of. So the involvement of folks who live in these communities is critically important, whether or not they have the technical expertise, just in terms of helping to identify resources that might be present and should be considered as part of these reviews.
Yeah, and just one last thing I'll say is, Adam brings up a good point. Again, without citizens pushing, our voice is just one more voice in the louder, in the broader scheme of things. I've seen 106 processes where a citizen was 10 times more skilled and schooled than I was with regard to the issues that we were talking about on the specific resource. So there are opportunities for citizens to participate at the same level as all these orgs that we're talking about, and they have the potential to request, to be a consulting party or to participate in these processes. And we always encourage that. Ultimately, it is that citizen-based knowledge at the local level that gives us an indication of what's important to that community.
So Mark Meyer has given a comment saying, could not agree more with the last comment, thought not likely in the case of the National Park Service, is sometimes limited in how they can respond to projects, and partners and other stakeholders are critical in weighing in. So that's just support for what you all just said.
I'll just, one more thing is, I get paid to say the things that they can't, I guess is the best way to put it. Again, it relies, they're as employees of the federal government, they're put in a really tough position sometimes to talk about these things, and ultimately sometimes it's left up to the community or groups like ours to express just how impactful certain projects would be on that resource. Because I do think, and this is by no means any criticism. I love the National Park Service. I just find that they are oftentimes tied and cannot say what needs to be said in some of these discussions.
Yeah, and Mark is from the National Park Service, so he's very aware. So I'm glad but it needs to be kind of recognized in a very sort of honest way. So I think that's also really important. And then since no one else is asking, I'm going to go ahead and ask. So what do you think is the most challenging aspect of being involved with these kinds of projects?
I think it's, again, what you find is, you have a certain level of expertise in one issue or another. And that's why, again, we try to bring as many groups and as many experts to the table in these discussions as possible. If it were not for a former staffer who had a lot of knowledge on impacts from excessive noise, I would not have been able to make some of the cases I've been able to make in the past about the auditory impacts on of certain projects. Had it not been for, say, the expertise of a Southern Environmental Law Center at the table, I'm sure I would have gotten in trouble legally a few times on making suggestions that were not quite appropriate. So again, like I said, it's recognizing that it takes a village, and that you as an individual have a lot to offer, but ultimately it's the collective that's going to get the positive outcome.
Right.
Yeah, I would echo what Dan says there, and just add to, I think one of the most important things that we found in these processes is bringing other groups to the table and making them aware. I think with the Manassas example, it was one particular organization that then alerted a number of others, including our own, that the issue was going on. And so it's sort of that collective having each other's backs when it comes to making folks aware, making different organizations aware that these processes are even happening. Because there's I think a lot of the times when these come up, and maybe only an organization or two is aware of them, whereas a lot more would be interested in weighing in.
I'm only smirking as Adam says that, because I can't tell you how many emails I've seen in the past. It's time to get the band back together on that old issue that you hate. And so these things don't go away too. The threats to these resources, again, while the threats may change, the level of threat to some of these resources never diminishes. So whether it's a road project, whether it's a data center, whether it's as development pressure increases in our region, we're going to continue to see these conflicts with those things that we deem critical to kind of preserving both our quality of life, but also, those aspects of our community that kind of define us. So.
Yeah, I think that's really important to understand. And I think in the realm, we're in the visual resource realm, and it's a realm that has, it has a long history, but it hasn't always been something that's been used and recognized outside of just public land management, right? So I think that it is something that is, I see as a great growth in it from an industry perspective. And, I'm hoping more people will kind of jump on that bandwagon and join you and others to move it forward. So since there doesn't seem to be any other questions right now, we'll go ahead and go early. We have a break till 3:45. Go to the James River Room and see what they have to offer there. There's also going to be, after our next session at 5 o'clock, there's going to be a wonderful walking tour of the history of James River in Richmond. So please join us all for that. That'll be in the James River Room as well. And then I'm just going to ask Becca, before I actually officially close this off, if there's anything else that we need to share. Make sure you all go to the silent auction. That closes tomorrow.
I think you've covered everything.
All right. Well, Dan and Adam, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I really enjoyed listening to what you had to say. And for those in the audience, this has been recorded, and so we will have that available afterwards. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Really appreciate it.